So I'm not usually a theory video type of person, but I have some thoughts on what might be going on behind the scenes in Deltarune chapters 3 and 4, and this video was originally going to be super short, but since it took me so long to record all the footage I needed, my thoughts ended up growing into 3 distinct mini-theories that I think are substantial enough that I really wanted to share them with you. So, here we go. Our first theory is really a bunch of, micro-theories all centered on Des. So first of all, we can pretty much all agree that Des is the knight, right? Okay, not actually all, but that does seem to be the prevailing theory, and for the moment, I agree. And since so many people have already covered that, I'm not going to go over all the evidence for it. I know that there are some people who think that it's Carol or even Rudy, and I can see some arguments for those, but for now, I do find the evidence for Des to be the most compelling. But while I'm not exactly sure what the knight is, like physically and stuff, I don't think Des is fully conscious as the knight, because I also do still think she's probably the one speaking in the unused text in the files. But admittedly, there isn't really any new evidence for or against this with the new chapters, it's just always been the most likely option. So I'm guessing it's something like the knight itself is what's left of Des's body, but her consciousness is either just lost in the game's files or deep within the darkness of the knight itself. That being said, some of Des's subconscious does appear to be present in the knight. For one thing, the way the knight moves during the boss fight definitely suggests some sort of personality. Second, I also think that the knight is the creepy voice talking to Chris on the phone. And from what I've seen, this is a bit of a spicy theory. I know that most people think it's Carol because of how it says, "I'll be right there" to Chris right before Carol shows up. Otherwise, without that line, it would be very easy to assume that the knight just went and told Carol everything Chris told them, and that's why Carol comes home early. But I actually have a different potential answer for this. I think that this line is every Deltarune theorist's favorite phrase, say it with me now, a massive red herring. Because not only do I think that this voice isn't Carol, mostly because of how she talks to Chris in a completely normal voice at the end of the weird route, but I also think that Carol and this voice, aka the knight, aren't even on the same side. First, let's talk about the "I'll be right there" line itself. It seems very possible to me that the knight was on its way, but Carol just happened to get there first. Yes, she did come home earlier than expected, but there are plenty of possible explanations for this. For all we know, she might have cameras around the house that Noelle doesn't know about that let her keep an eye on things while she's at work. That seems like something she would do. Or heck, it could be as simple as Gaster or the mysterious second voice from the intro telling her that Susie is at her house. I don't know. Obviously, all that is just speculation. I'm just trying to say that this one line does not make it impossible for the creepy voice on the phone to be someone other than Carol. Now, with that line out of the way, let's talk about some real evidence for them being on 2 different sides. What first clued me into something about this being weird is that Carol talks to Chris in a completely normal voice on the phone at the end of chapter 4 on the weird route, which seems to me to suggest that these 2 voices are different people. Now, could there be alternative explanations for this? Sure, but that's not all. Carol's final line in the normal route of this chapter, "As you know, you are welcome here at any time," with "you" in all caps and red. Add on to that how Carol apparently likes collecting red heart-shaped objects, and is Carol actually allied with the soul, with us the player, instead of Chris? I guess the "as you know" does make that a little weird, but there is maybe a tiny bit of evidence that the soul has actually been with Chris for a little longer than we have, maybe, But what I'm suggesting here is that the knight is allied with Chris, while Carol is allied with the soul. And we can also speculate that the knight and Chris are working for Gaster, while we and Carol are working for the other mysterious voice, but that's besides the point. This could explain why the knight calls Chris at the end of the normal route, while it's Carol who does so in the weird route when we arguably have the most control over the narrative. On top of that, it also helps clear up Carol's motives. Most people have speculated based on the conspiracy board in her room, plus her tendency to want to preserve things, plus it just making sense, that Carol is trying to get Des back. But then I have heard some raise the criticism that if Des is the knight, wouldn't Carol have her back already? Well, first of all, if I'm right about Des's consciousness being trapped somewhere, then either way, Carol wouldn't actually have her back yet. But if they are on different sides, then her motivation is even more clear. Heck, she might not even know that Des is the knight yet. I just think there's a lot of reason to think that they might be on different sides. Like, sure, both Carol and the voice don't want Susie to get the guitar, But they could very easily have different motivations for this. Plus, like, Susie's place in the story and the prophecy and everything, and like why she's the one who's super determined to make sure the prophecy doesn't come true, while also being the one who has constantly been ignoring player choice, is a whole other can of worms that I'm just not going into right now. So, say this voice is the knight, aka Des. In that context, I find this voice's final words to Chris at the end of chapter 4 particularly interesting. Follow me here for a second. Des almost definitely wrote Raise Up Your Bat, right? Obviously the Lost Girl motif is there, the whole bat thing lines up, and plus the somewhat generic punk rock teen sounding lyrics, it just makes sense. That song contains the lyric I am with you in the dark, just like Don't Forget does. And what does the voice say to Chris at the end of the chapter? Don't forget, you promised. The promise in our hearts. Don't forget, I'm with you in the dark. Is Des also the one singing Don't Forget? Even if not, she's everywhere now and I like it. I also toyed with the idea of her being the second hero in the prophecy, but I don't think so. I mean, it's definitely not Susie, except maybe this one, which says at last, making it sound like it's someone other than the second hero. But I only thought it was Des because of the sword before I noticed the wings. Guess Noelle will get a sword at some point for some reason, maybe? So with all these theories about where Des is now, I'm going to end this section by saying what I think happened to her. Not any sort of detailed theory about the incident, like how Asgore was involved or anything, but more of a thematic one. I think Des lost herself to fiction. Now, admittedly, we have not really heard anything about Des suggesting that she would be prone to doing something like this, but we've heard so relatively little about her at all that I still think it's very possible. Whether the incident that led to her disappearance was the actual moment she became the knight, or the incident was her falling into a dark world after which she decided that she preferred the fantasy to reality, I do think it makes the most thematic sense if Des, to put it in Kingdom Hearts terms, fell to darkness, thus becoming the knight. Perhaps the night is her body, covered in darkness, and her consciousness is trapped deep within, calling out in any way possible, hoping that someone will hear. In other words, she's basically this game's Flowey. Someone who made some bad choices that we, the player, will also have to make. Someone who, in the best ending, we will be able to at least to some extent save, but who, in the worst ending, we will become. Alright, theory number 2. This section's going to be a bit shorter, but let's talk about Ralsei for a bit. Everyone's trying to guess what specific object Ralsei is, right? He could be Chris's old fake horns, maybe Chris's knife or something? But the thing is, not all Darkners correspond to specific objects. Like Spamton, who is, what, just like the general concept of spam emails or something? I mean, there's like the trash can that has, or the dumpster bin that has printed out emails in it, but some of the enemies are also just like basic concepts and stuff, so my point still stands. And like chapter 2 is a little weird since a lot of the Darkners there are based on digital things instead of physical ones, but the point is that this is still possible. So what do we know about Ralsei? Not very much, honestly, but we do know that his fountain, the one in Castletown, is made from pure darkness, whatever that means. And what other fountain have we seen that might be made from pure darkness? I'm not saying that we know for sure the Titan's fountain is made from pure darkness. All I'm saying is, what if Ralsei is more similar to a Titan than to other Darkners? The Titans are the fear of the dark, so what if Ralsei is the love of the dark, of fiction? What if Ralsei represents the very concept of escapism itself? Think about it. Ralsei says that his purpose is to make Chris and Susie happy. And sure, the purpose of all Darkners is to serve the Lightners, but most of them can only do so in a way that is specific to the function of whatever light world object they represent. But Ralsei is trying to make them happy through any means necessary. This is why he wants Castletown to be a place where they can come to escape from reality, even after it becomes clear that reality is in danger from the night, and it's why he doesn't want them to see how the prophecy ends. So, if we apply this theory to our earlier hypothesis of why Des went missing, the idea that she lost herself to fiction, would this mean that Ralsei had something to do with her disappearance? After all, Chris isn't the only one who would find comfort in that particular familiar face. But now that I think about it, Ralsei is the one telling Chris and Susie to seal the fountains, all but his own, which is weird. And he does do things like tell them to go do their group project, so maybe he represents healthy escapism specifically, in which case he probably had nothing to do with Des going missing. Unless maybe he saw what happened to her and learned from it or something. I don't know. This section is probably the one that I'm the least sure about out of all these three, but I still thought it was interesting. And my last theory is actually based on another theory that I've been seeing pop up here and there, that being that we, the player, or at least the soul, are the angel. I'm not going to go into the evidence for that theory here, and I'm not even sure whether or not I actually buy it, but the idea still led me to some really interesting places. So if we are the angel, then what would the angel's heaven that Ralsei mentions in chapter 1 be, the thing that the three heroes are supposed to stop? From the perspective of this being a story about our relationship with fiction itself, what would heaven theoretically be for someone who really loves this story and these characters? Eternity. For the story to never end. And what happens when the fiction, or rather the darkness, goes on forever? The roaring. When our reality gets consumed by fiction, the Darkners eventually all turn to stone, the characters lose all meaning they once had, and all we're left with is the Titans, the fear of the dark, the things that our minds create that are not comforting, but scary. Of course, not every actual person playing this game will want that. I know I like the stories I get invested in to have actual endings. But even after they've ended, I always want to keep consuming content about them, and once I get tired of that, I want to find a new story. I know the temptation to lose myself in fiction, and honestly, if this is the angle that Toby is going for with this story, whatever conclusion this game is going to come to is going to be a pretty powerful one to people like me. But that's not all, because you know who else doesn't want the story to end? Susie. She literally says so during the secret boss fight in chapter 4. And by the end of the chapter, the number one thing on her mind is to make sure that the prophecy doesn't come true. Of course, at this point in the story, she probably will be looking for a way to do that while still saving the world. But what if it gets to the point where she becomes so desperate that she actually attempts to cause the roaring in order to avoid the prophecy coming true? This is veering into speculation territory, but I imagine that it could happen after her inevitable falling out with Chris and Ralsei. That will likely come from her finding out that Chris was being puppeted this whole time, and Ralsei knew about it but didn't say anything. Or taking into account the prophecy that says the angel banished will meet with its desire, plus Susie not actually being the second hero, maybe after Susie's falling out happens, Chris, Ralsei, and Noelle will succeed in banishing us from Chris, but then Susie will go on to cause the roaring anyway, thus in a way giving us our desire. Whatever the details, I do think that Susie's attempt to change the prophecy will instead end up inadvertently bringing it about, making it self-fulfilling. Not that there's no hope. I think the roaring will happen, or at least begin to, but then Susie will realize her mistake and find a way to reverse it. But in doing so, she will have no choice but to let the end of the prophecy that she was trying so hard to stop actually happen. What might that thing be? Well, I don't have any solid ideas, but I think it will just have something to do with allowing the Dark Worlds to end forever, having to say goodbye to Ralsei and Lancer forever. See, I don't think this is a story about changing fate. I think this is a story about fiction itself and how it can bring about good things, but all stories are fated to end one way or another. Despite having to lose Ralsei and Lancer, Susie will have much stronger relationships with Chris and Noelle than she ever would have without the Dark Worlds. And now, thanks to a certain old man, she will also have the will to go and create her own stories. Did I just accidentally figure out how Deltarune is going to end? Nah, probably not. Honestly, I'm not super convinced about any of this, except that Des is going to serve as our example of the dangers of escapism. That just makes too much sense to me thematically. But it's still fun to think about. But yeah, that's all I've got. Thanks for listening to my ramblings, and I guess I'll see you next time I feel like making a video. Also, we can add Carol to the list of potential candidates of people who Gaster might have been talking to in Entry 17, because it's very possible that the king's best friend's wife would have run into the royal scientist at some point and started some sort of secret shady business relationship. Okay, bye!